You said when I'm
Oh,
ready.
are we? That's
Yes.
fantastic. Okay. I thought, because usually when Marie says go, it's like a couple seconds. But anyway, good morning, everyone. Welcome to all of you this morning. We're just continuing our study through the book of Acts. We are in Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 21, rather, the latter part of that. I'm going to wind us back to verse 31. And what's going on here is Paul's arrest at the temple. There's been this long prophecy known to both Paul himself and to those in Paul's party about his impending arrest and eventually his martyrdom at the hands of the Jewish authorities under the auspices of Rome. And now that's beginning to unfold and to come to pass. Now, we saw last week that Paul went out of his way to try not to offend the Jews among him. He, in fact, took 2 disciples with him, took them through rites of Jewish purification to say that he doesn't have a problem with maintaining certain Jewish customs as a matter of practice, as long as it isn't as long as it isn't indicated as being essential to salvation. And now what's going to happen is we're going to see the details of Paul's arrest. And in looking at what happens here, I guess I point to 2 things that I think are, one that's of real present relevance to us in terms of our election season, and another that's just a great theological point. The first that I think is of relevance to where we are right now. As you know, we're on the edge of a presidential and national election. And Paul, as usual here, as he stands before the civil authority, he is going to consistently invoke, we need electrical power, because that's important. Get our computer going here. Okay, so he is going to consistently don't put our hope in princes, just as the Psalms warn us not to do. But on the other hand, we are actively engaged in preserving a good civil order for the gospel and for following civil authorities insofar as they do not compel us to do or say things that are contrary to the gospel. So that's the first thing I watch. And then the second thing is just the steadfast integrity with which Paul, we are shown him imitating Christ in many ways by the way he stands before the Jewish leaders and makes his confession. And I'll point out some of those. Tell us a little about Fox's Book of Martyrs.
Can't tell you much about it. I've got a copy. I've read parts of it.
Who paid with their lives. And one of the things you know is that, especially in the early years of the church, the patterns of their persecution, their trial, and their witness were all conformed. Back, looked at the gospel, and then just cut and pasted this other Christian's martyrdom on top. But I think not. I think guiding power, model, his example, and his actions, even in some cases his word, regular engagement of Scripture a priority in your life, because it is the only way that you're formed by the Spirit for time testing. Regular engagement with the Word, read, preached, and studied. So that's where we're headed. These are the main points. Paul's use of political authority and the way in which his witness is going to conform to that of Christ before his persecutors. So any questions about that by way of general overview before we head into the text? You just pondering, or do you have a question?
I can't quite put a question together.
Okay, well, it'll come to you. I know it will. So, Paul is arrested at the temple, and as I said, I'd like to wind back. Actually, let's wind back to verse 30 and take 30 to 34.
The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, He ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks.
So this is just kind of a rewind. Do you remember that? So the reason that Paul is in such trouble here, he's got trumped up charges by the Jewish leaders for two reasons. The fact that he's preaching Christ as the Messiah, which is regarded as blasphemous, and the question of this man, Trophimus, his Gentile disciple, who's come into the temple beyond the court of the Gentiles. And there's some debate about, did Paul actually let him in there? It doesn't actually say that explicitly. At the very least, Paul didn't oppose him being there, assuming that he knew. And that probably has something to do with Paul not wanting Gentiles to be excluded from the preaching of the word and from the gathering of other Christians around who might be there in the temple. But in any case, those are the two reasons that he's facing the wrath. What finally gets them to leave Paul alone?
Soldiers, basically.
Yeah, the soldiers in the end, right? And this is you kind of get the same thing even in the crucifixion of Jesus, that the Roman soldiers are able to keep some degree of order. And the one man who stands against the injustice, at least for a time, imperfectly and in the end ineffectively, is Pilate, because he's at least trying to uphold the basis of Roman law. Romans were very big on the protection of a person's property and person. Because if you had any undermining of, you can imagine this, right? You actually see this in our own cities. With every building that gets torn down and every business that gets torched, what is the effect on that for our respect and our reliability on our civil authorities, right? We're all sitting there going like, well, I don't know. I don't think these guys can handle it. Rome was very careful about maintaining civil order. And there's a recognition here, even among this mob, for as bitter and as hateful as they are, there's a respect for the civil law and authority under. And this has to do with, I don't know if it has to do with ancient law or human perception. This is how Rome reacted. Because they arrest the victim, the reason for that is, well, if this guy's being beaten up by the mob, he must have done something really bad, or this will make the mob happy, right? The mob respects us, but the Romans don't want. There's a tightrope they have on, right? You get into bloodshed and open revolt. Well, then all of a sudden word passes to the territorial governor, and in turn, the problem rolls all the way uphill, and then heads begin to roll. There's problems, right? It turns out that there's the work of an actual armed revolt somewhere in the territory. The Romans have to do something about that. And that's the place where people lose their jobs or even their lives. So if you can avoid bloodshed and open revolt, you always do. So it may not even be a recognition of guilt, it's entirely anyway a recognition of guilt per se, as it is, we arrest this man in part to just get him. They arrest him, and immediately there in verse 33, you'll notice, after he's bound, the centurion, he inquired who he was and what he had done. So yeah, he's assuming this guy's done something, not necessarily. And when it says what he had done, it doesn't necessarily mean what he's done wrong, but it's kind of like, why are a whole mob full of people trying to bludgeon you to death here in this? This is where you start to see Luke subtly painting the details in the imitation of Christ. When Christ goes to his trial, some make one accusation against him, some another, and remember, actually, I think it's John who says that their statements explicitly contradict each other. They can't get things straight. And the same sort of nonsense is happening here. Now, what I think is unique about that is the fact that they're shouting over the top of each other and there's no consistent charge actually being given. What does that tell us about the nature of the charges against Paul and the nature of the people bringing them, right?
Well, they was both, the crowd was confused. One was saying one thing, one was another thing, and it was all mixed up, so they couldn't make the point come across what they were going to do. Yeah,
there's no real truth to it. Even though there's a great deal of ire and a great deal of frustration, there's no consistency. And ultimately, I think Luke is saying subtly, no reality to it. And here's what I think is important about that. I come particularly susceptible to this. And the charges can change, the quotes can be taken out of this. And I think that speaks to two things for the Christian. The one is, be careful about what you say, and make sure that what you say is true and well documented and faithful to the scriptures. But on the other hand, don't be surprised if after all that effort, you still face the ire of the world, you still face persecution, you still face evil. And don't let this world's reaction to your words and deeds be the standard by which you judge them. This is another reason that grounding ourselves in God's word is so important. It is only natural as human beings, as social creatures, that we are driven to seek to a certain degree the approval, the acceptance of others, to go along, to get along, and to use that as the standard. It's part of why I think this is one of the things I'm really grateful. This will sound weird, but I'm kind of grateful for COVID because I think it's what's going on, right? And immediately I'm using the perceptions of other people to gauge the success and the goodness of the church's ministry. Whereas what should always be the ground is the faithfulness and the truthfulness of what we say and do as the people of God. So any questions about that observation or thoughts? Okay, and then of course, so that takes us down to now he's in the barracks, that means he's basically in jail. So let's just finish out verses 35 and 36 and come into this section. Someone would take that, 35 and 36.
When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him."
Yeah, or away with him. And do you understand, this is, you understand what that last part means? That's coded language, kind of. What do they want? Just so we're clear. Yeah, they want him dead. They don't just mean like, send him off to exile. They mean away with him to death. Same way that Jesus is led away to the chance of crucify him, so this man is led away with this man. Do away with him, essentially. And again, I would come back to this note of civil authority. I think you got to give the Romans some props here. What did they do? So they could get him out of there. I mean, I think this is significant.
Carry.
Yeah, they pick him up and carry him out. And the reason for that, you get this, right? I mean, this is like, I don't know. I never did mosh pits when I was a kid. I never got into that, even though that was, you get down to the bottom of a big dance pit and you can get trampled down there, right? And the idea is, here is this ravenous mob. And I mean, in some ways, I'm just kind of all about Roman. I think the Roman military are just fascinating. They were tough guys. They weren't exactly the most scrupulous people in the world, and they weren't the kind of people you wanted to meet in a bar after they'd had a little too much wine or something, but they were tough, duty-bound sort of men. And there's a recognition here that even they don't yet know he's a Roman citizen, but they do know he is a man within Rome. The prosecution of justice only after a proper trial and hearing, pretty serious. And I think you see that here. And it's again, it's part of the reason I come back to this is we're right in the midst of a political. And whatever you think about our present commander-in-chief, one thing you do have to say is that he's campaigned solidly on the basis of that you need law and order to preserve some measure of functionality when people become angry and to preserve life and property. And I think that's a basic biblical. I think maybe it's why Paul is at such pains in his letter to the Romans to extol the virtue of civil authority, even if that authority isn't perfect. So any questions about that, any thoughts about this role of civil authority here, or the soldier's actions in relations to Paul, or its significance in the narrative? Okay, then we'll take the next part here, 37 to 40, to the end of the chapter.
As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. And when they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic.
Okay, so we'll leave off and we'll come right into that. But just I want to give a little background because you're probably that like, who's this Egyptian guy and what's the deal here, right? What are they talking about? So just a little background. So they're there in the midst of this huge crowd, and it's interesting. I think, first of all, what's fascinating is this little detail. How does Paul address the soldier? In Greek. He uses one of the lingua francas of the region he's in, which kind of surprises this guy. I hear it too. I can't believe you know Greek. But he's able to use a little bit of cultural working here to break down a barrier and then get an audience with the crowd for the proclamation of the gospel. I do think there's an interesting point there, and there are questions about how far does a church go to reach out, or in an individual congregation in the midst of a changing cultural context. One thing I think there's absolutely no dispute about. Two ministries I would commend to you are the Lutheran Heritage Foundation and the Lutheran Bible Translators. They are doing amazing work. The Lutheran Heritage Foundation has seen literally tens of thousands of Muslims in Germany and converted in large part because we're able to get them materials in Arabic to use, because it breaks down that barrier and allows for understanding. That's just a little thing here that starts, and then he asks, can I say something to you? You know Greek? And then he asks, are you that Egyptian? And you're going like, what Egyptian?